Michael Carter's life changed the day he was wrongfully arrested by the very people who were supposed to protect him. But what started as a personal battle for justice soon grew into something much larger, an effort to heal a broken system. This isn't just a story of one man's fight for fairness, it's a story of resilience, community, and the undeniable truth that real change begins when you refuse to stay silent. Michael Carter had always been the type of man who believed in the system. He was a teacher at the local high school, a husband to his wife, Sarah, and a father to 2 young kids. He lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, went to church on Sundays, and tried his best to be a good citizen. For him, the world worked the way it was supposed to, people followed the rules, and justice, eventually, would prevail. One evening, after a long day of teaching, Michael was driving home from a school meeting. It was a typical night, clear skies, not much traffic. He'd just turned onto a side street when his rearview mirror lit up with the flashing red and blue lights of a police car. He wasn't speeding, he thought. No reason for this, but he pulled over anyway. The officer who approached his car looked young, maybe in his late 20s, and gave a curt greeting, asking for his license and registration. Michael handed them over, politely asking if there was a problem. The officer, barely looking at him, said, "Just stay put. We'll be a minute." It was strange, but Michael thought it was just routine. However, moments later, 2 more cars pulled up, and suddenly, Michael was surrounded. A third officer came to the window, this one a little older, with a more aggressive tone. "Step out of the car," the officer said. Michael, confused, asked, "Why? What's going on?" Without warning, the officer yanked the door open and pulled Michael out of the car. "You're under arrest for resisting," the officer barked, even though Michael hadn't done anything to resist. Michael was shocked. He didn't know what was happening or why this was happening. He tried to stay calm, to explain, but before he could say another word, the officer threw him to the ground, his face slamming into the pavement. The sound of his head hitting the street echoed in his ears. His body went stiff in pain, and he felt the cold metal of handcuffs biting into his wrists. It all happened so fast. His mind raced. What did I do wrong? He hadn't even raised his voice. He had simply asked a question. But there he was, on the ground, in cuffs, with the whole situation unfolding like a nightmare. Michael was taken to the station, where he was processed and held for a few hours before being released. He was shaken, confused, but mostly angry. The events of that night played over and over in his mind. He kept asking himself, "Why me?" But what hurt the most was the overwhelming sense of betrayal. He'd always believed the police were there to protect him, to protect everyone. They were supposed to be the ones who made the community safer, not the ones who hurt you. Yet here he was, a victim of police brutality in the very neighborhood he'd grown up in. The worst part was the feeling that this wasn't an isolated incident. He wasn't the first person this had happened to, and he wouldn't be the last. When the body cam footage from the officers was released, and later the bystander videos surfaced online, the truth was undeniable. Michael wasn't just a victim of an angry cop. He was a victim of a system that had been failing people like him for years. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't just one bad officer. This was part of a larger, systemic problem: police violence, racial profiling, and a lack of accountability within law enforcement. Michael didn't know it yet, but that night was only the beginning of something bigger. The first few weeks after the incident were difficult. Michael's injuries, bruised ribs, a cut on his forehead, and a sprained wrist, healed, but the emotional scars ran much deeper. His confidence in the justice system had been shattered, and he didn't know what to do next. Should he just let it go, move on with his life, or fight back? His wife, Sarah, stood by him, but even she wasn't sure what the right thing to do was. "Maybe we just take the settlement, Michael," she suggested one evening, sitting with him on their couch. "We've been through enough." But Michael wasn't someone who backed down from injustice. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what he did. So he made the decision to fight, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been on the receiving end of unjust treatment by the police. He reached out to a lawyer who specialized in police misconduct. The lawsuit was filed, but Michael knew that legal action alone wouldn't bring about real change. He needed to speak out, to make sure the issue wasn't buried under the weight of indifference. Michael began attending town hall meetings, speaking at rallies, and engaging with local activists who were already working on reform efforts. Slowly, he began to see that this wasn't just about one man's fight, it was about the need for accountability within the police force, for reform, and for a new way forward. He started sharing his story, not just to gain sympathy, but to spark a movement. Michael wanted people to know that this wasn't a one-off incident. This was happening every day, in communities across the country. He spoke honestly, from the heart, I'm just an ordinary guy. A teacher. A father. And if this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. As Michael's case gained attention, something incredible began to happen. People who had been silent, victims of police abuse, families who had lost loved ones to senseless violence, began speaking out. At first, it was just a handful of people, but soon there was a groundswell. A movement was growing, and it was centered around one simple truth: we are not alone. Michael's story resonated with so many people. His words weren't just about a broken system, they were about hope. They were about rebuilding trust in each other, in the community, and yes, in the police force, too. He wasn't calling for the police to be torn down, but for them to be held accountable for their actions. For them to be trained better. For them to act with the same respect for human dignity that they expected from the rest of the public. At one of the rallies, Michael stood before a crowd, surrounded by people who had shared their stories, who had stood with him in the fight for justice. His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't hesitate. This is bigger than just one incident. This is about making sure that no one else ever goes through what I did. We need to hold the police accountable. We need to make sure our children grow up in a world where they can trust the people who are supposed to protect them. And in that moment, the crowd stood with him, a powerful reminder that when people unite, real change is possible. As the months passed, Michael's efforts began to show results. The local police force was placed under greater scrutiny, with new measures for accountability and transparency being put in place. There were new policies around de-escalation tactics and racial sensitivity training for officers. And while these changes weren't perfect, they were a start. A start that wouldn't have happened without Michael's refusal to stay silent. But Michael knew that the road ahead was still long. The fight for justice wasn't something that would end with one case or one victory. It was a fight that had to be carried on every day, in every neighborhood, in every interaction with law enforcement. In his final speech at a community event, Michael looked out at the faces of the people who had joined him along the way, and he said, "This isn't over. This is just the beginning. The fight for justice, true justice, is something we'll have to keep fighting for, together, every single day." Michael Carter's story is far from finished. It's the story of one man who refused to stay quiet, who refused to let his pain be forgotten. But it's also the story of a community, a movement, and a country in need of change. And while the road ahead may still be difficult, Michael remains steadfast in his commitment. The fight for justice isn't just for one person, it's for all of us.